leave the roads, searching the countryside and villages. Prisoners are taken, some of the few found in the nearly deserted towns. On the second day of their thrust up the main coastal road to Seoul, the task force enters the outskirts of Suwon, carefully searching every building for concealed Reds. Scattered enemy resistance is quickly cleaned out. Meanwhile, sizable gains are recorded north of Icheon and Kumyangjang, while the naval shelling of Incheon moves into its second day. The day after Suwon's capture, an armored spearhead leaves the north gate, pushing on towards the Han River. Soon it meets the first strong Red defensive lines, halting 12 miles from Seoul. General Joseph S. Bradley, assistant commander of the 25th Division, inspects his advancing troops. The customary inspection and interrogation of civilians begins at Suwon. 25th Division rest, as reports come in that firm contact has finally been re-established with major units of the enemy. UN troops, in the second week of their limited offensive, battle northward toward Seoul, continuing to forge ahead over the bitterly contested ground north of Suwon. In the new system of United Nations offense, forced by communist hold-or-die tactics, Allied forces leave the roads and dig the Reds from their caves and foxholes. Enemy dead litter the ridge. Chinese prisoners, routed out of the hills, are thoroughly searched and administered first aid by soldiers of the 25th Division. The face of an American GI expresses the bitter sadness that comes with war. The captives are then escorted to the rear for further interrogation. Very few Chinese surrender to UN forces, as they are taught to expect swift execution upon capture. When convinced that they will not be killed, they are often eager to give information. A United Nations task force moves up for an assault on an enemy-held ridge north of Suwon, as the offensive pushes steadily ahead. Realizing the dangers of over-fatigue, these hardened soldiers have learned to take advantage of every opportunity to rest. Now, well accustomed to the strenuous conditions of battle, the men group together in a well-earned sleep. General Bradley consults with the company commander of the Spearhead Unit, which will attack the communist strongpoint lying across the main road to Seoul. Tank commanders determine Red positions and ready their crews for firing. The attack gets underway with the usual preparatory artillery bombardment. The fighting in this sector has been some of the bitterest of the Korean campaign. Key points change hands repeatedly, and gains are measured in yards. The tanks move up to new positions nearer the ridge and continue to blast away at the communist emplacements. The enemy returns the fire and scores a near miss on one of our tanks. A South Korean 57mm battery adds its firepower to the assault as the bombardment proceeds to soften up the Reds for the infantry attack. A South Korean officer calls for mortar fire, and the mortars lend their explosive voice to the artillery pounding. Paced by this support, the column brings the full force of its firepower to bear on the Red-dominated hill. Throughout Korea during the first week of February, observers are noticing more and more the high morale evidenced by the UN soldiers. With assured faith in their leaders and confidence in their own ability as a fighting team, the troops of 14 nations forge ahead in the push northward toward the Han River and Seoul.
In the seesaw battle with positions changing daily, airdrops keep Allied forces supplied when roadblocks impede ground transport. Few more valiant performances have been given during the Korean War than that of the airlift, which shuttles round the clock from Japanese bases. Thousands of tons of supplies and fuel have been flown to crucial areas. Cold, everlasting, bone-chilling cold dogs the troops as they stabilize their positions in the South Korean hills just below the 38th parallel, positions from which they have every chance to launch counterattacks that take a fearful toll of Reds. But as always, there are the long lines of refugees seeking desperately an escape from the war that has engulfed their land. There are miles of them, swept back and forth by the changing tides of war. Some of them have been moved to neighboring islands, but most have no destination. They are the pitiful pawns of a struggle global in scope. Despite desperate efforts by the United Nations to secure a ceasefire order from Beijing, nothing but a flat rejection has been met. Secretary of State Acheson comments on the latest Red reply.
The reply of the Chinese Communists to the United Nations ceasefire proposal is still further evidence of their contemptuous disregard of a worldwide demand for peace. Their so-called counter-proposal is nothing less than an outright rejection. Once again, the Beijing regime has shown a total lack of interest in a peaceful settlement of the Korean question.
In late February, we made a fresh start, an Operation General Ridgway graphically called Operation Killer. The Chinese armies held a staggering superiority of numbers, and Ridgway's intent was simple: cut down the odds.
These hill positions anchor the right flank of the Red Central Sector offensive. By commanding the heights, UN troops hope to flank and cave in the communist advance. 4.2 heavy mortars join in the barrage. The communists held fast in these hills during most of the Allied limited offensive of the last 3 weeks. Now, with the launching of the Reds' counteroffensive down the Central Mountains, the communists cling tenaciously to this strong hill salient, which guards the right flank of their drive toward Wonju. Observers watch strikes on the enemy hill positions. Under cover of the barrage, the men push up the steep terrain towards the objective. Protected by the thick and tangled underbrush, the Reds laid down a volume of small arms fire that causes the troops to slow down in their advance. During the last 10 days, key points in this hill area have repeatedly changed hands, with Allied gains being held down to a few thousand yards. The troops keep watch for snipers, plotting the course to be followed when the assault is resumed. Meanwhile, machine gun positions are set up as they consolidate their gains against a possible Red counter-thrust. The communist lines are strong, and artillery fire is called for to loosen enemy supporting areas. In spite of the initial bombardment, the Reds hold firm in their emplaced positions, dominating the heights. The howitzer shells smash lethal punches into the face of the enemy. The steep grade slows the advance. Attacking in battalion strength, the troops move up as fast as possible to avoid Red sniper fire. Red forces have relied heavily on surprise night attacks, attempting to regain positions taken from them during the day by UN units. The communist tactics of infiltration and sudden mass charges fit well with the dense foliage. Supporting fire is supplied by heavy machine guns. The attack gets underway. The new assault carries forward to one section of the hill's crest, where UN troops are able to bring fire directly on the main enemy positions in close, rugged fighting. The attack is turned back. However, at week's end, an all-out drive crushes these positions, collapsing the right flank of the Reds' offensive. By the 18th of February, UN forces seize the initiative again as Operation Killer forges northward in the wake of the ill-fated Red breakthrough attempt. On the 10th of February, troops of the 25th Division reached the outskirts of Seoul. The Han River Bridge figures once more in the Korean fighting, and a familiar sign still stands. 3 badly frightened Chinese prisoners are brought in for questioning. Expecting execution, they face only interrogation and removal to PW compounds. Attempting to cross the Han, a patrol is halted temporarily by intense fire from the communists occupying Seoul. Later, another patrol managed to enter the city but withdrew after some limited probing. As the action continues with opposing forces dueling from opposite sides of the Han, other UN task forces are sweeping north and west to occupy Incheon and Kimpo. At the week's close, 4 Allied divisions are at the Han, and Seoul is nearly surrounded. As the United Nations offensive goes into its 3rd week, the communist defense becomes more stubborn and fanatical. Enemy troops give ground slowly along most of the front in the face of spirited Allied attacks. Here in the central sector north of Incheon, 24th Division troops recapture Hill 704, which was taken from them by a Red assault on the previous night. A prisoner points out nearby Chinese positions. The big guns of the U.S. tanks are prepared for action, and having pinpointed enemy concentrations on the adjacent hills, bring their massed firepower to bear on the stubbornly resisting Reds entrenched on the slopes. In constant communication with the Fire Control Center, the tanks continue their heavy bombardment. The enemy is blasted relentlessly in preparation for the following infantry attack. Above Wonju, a flying boxcar delivers ammunition and supplies to the 10th Corps, which is preparing a new assault against increasing Red pressure in the central mountain sector. Supply by airdrop, once an emergency measure, has become routine in Korea. With the spring thaws due soon, and with them the almost impassable Korean mud, these techniques of airborne logistical support will permit continued supply operations.
While United Nations diplomats seek a solution for a ceasefire order in Korea, a stalemate develops along the narrowing front below the 38th parallel. The white-suited ground troops plunge back through the snow toward Wonju and make their best gains since the fall of Seoul. The repeated patrol thrusts of the forces under General Clark Ruffner continue to keep the enemy off balance. Refugees captured and questioned by United Nations military informed their captors that the Chinese and North Korean Reds had withdrawn to new positions several miles north of Wonju. Repeated interrogation by United Nations officials revealed that information that gave birth to the latest offensive. Columns rush back to Wonju, strategic rail and road center. The questions of aggression by Chinese Reds, sanctions, and the ceasefire are matters still to be settled by the United Nations and Beiping.